So just before I came up these stairs, Pedro sits there and I ask him, he should be the keeper of my time and should signal me when I have to end. Because normally, unless somebody forces me to end, I just don't end. And now I must tell you something that I don't like to tell you, but it is important that you understand. The German government in place today, put by the Allies as an occupation government, they are of the opinion that anything a German says or writes, and I suppose thinks, they are in control of through their judiciary. So what I say today in Mexico, and what I said for 42 years in Canada, and for my time I lived in the United States, it made no difference to this German government in place today that I did not offend against the laws of Canada, did not offend against the laws in the United States, but I offended against the law of the place where I was born and I had left in 1958. And so they conspired for decades to get me arrested in the countries that I lived in and to be brought back to the land of my birth in handcuffs and to try me there for the things that I thought, wrote, and spoke in countries where it was perfectly legal. And so your organizers asked me to talk about the creation of the Leuchter Report. But I think I need to embed the story of the Leuchter Report with a little background of how it came into being, why I was the one to eventually be the one to organize it. I was born in the Black Forest in Germany to very poor people. I was a real paysan in Germany. My father was a lumberjack. My mother was a simple woman with a grade 3 education. Very strong Christian. My mother, she had these values. She was a Catholic. My father was a Protestant. My mother was a Catholic. So you could say that I was an integrated German. And she taught me very, very strong values, especially about truth, truthfulness. My mother hated lies. And that's why I suppose, became a warrior against lies. And so I left Germany at the age of 18 and a half because I was to be drafted into the German army. And I was a Christian, a pacifist, and did not want to join a new army, this time with American steel helmets and American uniforms. And I decided to write to different countries in the world, where could a young man go without being drafted against his will to serve in the armed forces of this country. So I wrote to Argentina. I wrote even to South Africa. I wrote to Canada. I wrote to New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. There was only one country in the whole world at that time, 1957, where a young man did not have to go and join the army against his will. And that was Canada. And there was another good reason for that. I like southern countries. I would have liked to go to New Zealand or to Australia. But when Christmas came, they had Christmas and the sun was shining. And in my Christmas, it was always snowing. And in Canada, they had snow on Christmas. So that's why I chose Canada. So sometimes things can be very simple, like snow on Christmas. Not world political event, but snow on Christmas. That was a very important thing for me. And I never regretted, even though Canada treated me, the official, the government, and the people behind the government, they treated me pretty nastily. And my mother in my ear saying, Ernst, don't lie, fight against lies. I came across every time I turned my Canadian television on, opened my Canadian newspapers, opened my Canadian school books, opened my children's school books, went to university, opened the school books. I saw nothing but lies. So what was I to do? Not naturally. My mother in my ear, Ernst, you got to stop this. And so I was predestined to have a rough life, meaning intellectually. Economically, Canada was like paradise. Canada was one fantastic country in the 1950s and in the 1960s. And after I arrived there, I prospered very quickly, went to night school, met my first wife, and then, of course, got married, had a baby, and I opened my first business when I was 20 years old. I never worked for anybody else. I became an independent businessman when I was 20 years old. And so, let me see, that was in English Canada. Met my wife at night school. She was French-Canadian. And when she got pregnant, she got homesick, like many women do, They have a kind of a hormonal problem and a hormonal change. And I didn't know what was happening. Because here I was in this new country, and she says, I want to go to be with my people, French Canadians. I was just learning English. I was happy that I could communicate in English, and now she wants to go to Quebec. And of course, I didn't know any French, but I loved her, and a baby was on the way. And so we went to Quebec, and I started all over again learning French. And once again, I could speak French good enough that I made good money. And for 9 years, I spent in Quebec. And in Quebec, God intervened, sending me a man called Adrien Arcan, a French-Canadian, very brilliant man, spoke 5 languages, strong Protestant, a strong conservative Catholics. And he taught me the political ropes, because before the war, he was the leader of a French-Canadian Catholic National Socialist Party. So here I come from Germany, the young fellow that is a pacifist, and not a thought about swastikas in my mind or Hitler. Actually, I was so brainwashed in these Allied schools that I believed everything nasty that was ever said about my own German people. And it was this French-Canadian man who, by the way, had spent 5 years in a Canadian concentration camp for his pro-German thinking. And he, within 3.5 hours that I met him, some Italians from the Movimento Sociale Italiano introduced me in Montreal to this French-Canadian, and he took 3.5 hours only to de-brainwash me. I was like a deprogrammed, and I was deprogrammed with facts. Monsieur Arcan, Monsieur Arcan had been given by Rudolf Hess thousands and thousands of books, because he was this National Socialist Party leader in Canada. And the French-Canadian and the police in Canada had not seized these books. When he came out of a concentration camp, there were all these Rudolf Hess donated books. And when I arrived at his house, I became the kind of beneficiary of Rudolf Hess's generosity by having all these fantastic National Socialist books. The Canadian police didn't take one book. And so Monsieur Arcan made his library available to me, and I had the benefit of what you could call a National Socialist education, a little time removed, but by Monsieur Arcan. And Monsieur Arcan was an orator par excellence and a tremendous student of human psychology. And he took to me because his own sons didn't care when he came out of the concentration camp. They thought that their father was a traitor to Canada and so on. And so I became, in a way, the political heir to his thinking. And I remember he on that first day saying to me, "Oh, so you hate Hitler, and you say all these nasty things about Adolf Hitler, and I can hear only propaganda speaking from you. You obviously have not read anything that he personally wrote. So I would recommend that you go to Montreal, and in Montreal there's a large Jewish community, and they have all kinds of copies of Mein Kampf, and then you can go and buy Mein Kampf, and then you study that, and then you come and see me." So I go into Montreal, and I go to the first Jewish bookstore, and a Polish Jew, I was so embarrassed to say to this Polish Jew that I wanted to buy Mein Kampf. So I struggled around. I said, "Well, I think I'm looking for a book called My Struggle." And so the Polish Jew pointed at me and he says, "Mein Kampf wollen Sie?" In German, he said to me, "Oh, you want Mein Kampf?" And I blushed, paid him the $5. It bought my first copy of Mein Kampf. Took it home, retreated to my bedroom. My French-Canadian wife and the baby were shocked because I never came out of that bedroom for the next 2.5 days. And Shanique kept saying, "Oh, mon chéri, what is this? What are you reading?" Very interesting that this girl who was very apolitical, had a radar like many women do. She knew that this book, Mein Kampf, was dangerous, was a danger to our marriage and to myself. But anyways, I took to it, and that book changed my life. But that book changed my life. And so Monsieur Arca took me under his wings, and he used to organize some political get-togethers and lend me his books every week, every second week. I would go with my wife to his house, who was 50 miles away in the farming area. I would get books from his library, and he would lend me 2-3 books per week. I studied them, and when I brought them back, then we would sit down and we would discuss this book. And as a little aside, Monsieur Arca died in 1967. In 1977, I found in the newspaper in Toronto that said Ernst Zündel inherited the library of Monsieur Arca, and he married the daughter of Monsieur Arca. Both untrue. I did imbibe his books, not by being given physical access, and him giving me his library. I stored it all in my head. And so the very first person that pointed me to the possibility, now I have to be careful because of the way the Germans interpret my freedoms. The very first chance that I got to see that there might be something wrong with this, with the interpretation of German guilt in World War II, came through this Monsieur Arca in faraway Canada, who had gotten a publication that statistically proved that there was something wrong. So I'm 6,000 miles away in Canada, and for the first time my nose is being directed that this terrible thing from which all Germans feel so guilty might not possibly all true. So you could say that a revisionist was born in far-off Canada. And because I'm a character that from the thought to the action doesn't take very long, and because I was making very good money as a graphic artist, I could afford to travel the world at a very young age, 21, 22, 23, and Monsieur Arca had contacts all around the world. And so he signed a letter for me, 5 languages, a letter of introduction. One was to Admiral Sir Barry Domville from England. Others were German politicians and French thinkers. And so I got, at age 23, 24, a chance to go and visit and interview famous European thinkers who were still alive, who had been alive during the Second World War. And so at a very early age, very young age, I got introduced to the best minds that had survived World War II. And when I came back from my trip around, that was to Europe, I took my wife, my French-Canadian wife, with me and the baby, and we went everywhere in Europe. I bought a Volkswagen, we drove all the way down to, Alicante, and finally to Gibraltar, and up to Biarritz, and back through Paris, and over to London, where I had to see all these people. So you could say it was a learning trip to Europe. When I came back to university, my doubts, I took political science at the university in Montreal, my doubts kept growing and growing. And in the university publication, I had my own column. It was called Politics, Past, Present, and Future, in which I touched on these topics. And because I was a kind of gifted in palavering and speaking, I participated in talk shows, which were very popular in America and in Canada at that time. And I was able to hone my skills about oratory, speaking, debating on these talk shows. Where all you do is you call in and you give your 5 cents worth, and other people call in, and then you have this heated debate. And I loved that medium. That was really something for me. And I grew intellectually and realized there was something terribly wrong with World War II history. And I began to read serious books. I had met these serious thinkers, and eventually I decided I was going to investigate this issue myself. No, I'm not going to use this forum to dispute the Holocaust, because that could get me 5 years in prison in Germany. I mean, if this broadcast goes anywhere and I were to do that, I would be arrested tomorrow, and because I'm a repeat offender, I would get 5 years in prison. So I'd be very careful how I'm going to phrase my stuff about the Leuchter document. And I found, by studying this European history, that we were dealing with words and paper, and maybe with some luck, some photos, and even some newsreels. But we were not dealing with hard science. You know, you can forge documents, you can change documents, you can misinterpret documents, but science, hard science, you cannot change. And so I was looking for a way of stopping the palaver, of stopping words, endless words. These European intellectuals, they kept like a dog chasing its own tail, interpreting, misinterpreting, reinterpreting documents, and I frankly found it boring. And then finally I met a French-Canadian professor in Los Angeles, California, at the first meeting, or the founding meeting, of the Institute for Historical Review. The man who headed that place then was a man called Willis Cardo, and I was the only Canadian delegate to that meeting in Los Angeles. And Willis Cardo had sent a man, called me, come on to my office. Dr. Forison, the famous French revisionist, is too tired from his long trip. Could you go and present his paper? Read it to this audience. I had never read the paper. And as I'm going, self-evidently, naturally I will do that. Because Carto said, well, you speak German, French, and English, and it would be the ideal person to present this paper. And so I began reading. And I had asked Dr. Forison, although he was tired, I said, Dr. Forison, could you be nearby in case I needed your help? And so here was the great professor. I was reading his paper, and my eyes were getting bigger and bigger, because here was this famous French revisionist saying, what we need to do is shift this debate to scientific levels. We must let science speak. And he was of the opinion that we should bring into the courtroom or in the even public debate, we should bring a person that had experiencing, oh boy, dare I say it, in killing people with gas. And nobody in Europe had any experience with that. Well, I must be careful with the way I say that. Anyways, the Germans, no, I can't say that either. Only in America were they killing people with gas. And so Dr. Forrison had gone to American gas chambers and spoken to people who actually knew the process. And he said in this paper, he said, we should find an individual that had a permit to kill people with gas, and preferably, of course, it should be an American because that's where it was done. And it was to me like Harambe, you know. My mind immediately realized, oh, this could be the answer. We could end all this blizzard of paper and documents and stuff like that, and we could elevate this debate to the scientific debate where it has a chance to be fairer. That thought never left me. I left that conference, went back home to Toronto, Canada, and started to try to find, like a detective, try to find somebody that had actually operated gas chambers or killed people by gas. And so I wrote to the American Information Agency and asked, please give me the addresses of all the American prisons where they kill prisoners with gas. I need to know somebody that can operate or has operated, even if they're retired, a gas chamber. And back came a letter a few weeks later from the American Information Agency. They gave me 4 addresses because the Supreme Court in the United States had given up gassing people, that they had stopped it for whatever reason, for about 10, 12, 15 years. And so I thought to myself, there cannot be very many American officials that are experienced with this. And one letter came from an American, he was the chief administrator of Missouri State Penitentiary. And he was an old Marine, an old soldier. And he sent a color photograph of him. Behind was an American flag, he in his uniform. And he wrote back, he said, Mr. Zündel, I have a permit to gas people. So I immediately wrote back to him with my lawyer's help. We would like to have you appear in one of my trials. Since you have a license to kill people, then you could explain to the court how this is done and so on. He agreed to come. I was recharged. I was so many times in Canadian courts that I can't even count it on all my 10 fingers. And I was once again in this court case that had started in January 1988, and we were already halfway into what was February when I finally got that letter. And so Armentrout agreed to come, and I was naturally pretty happy that I'd finally some expert that with hands-on experience. But he went one better. He testified, gave all the 34 points of how difficult it was, this method of execution and so on. And then during lunchtime, he said to me, Ernst, why did you call me? Why didn't you call my technician? And I didn't even know there was a technician. And so I said, what do you mean? Well, he's the one that repaired and upgraded our gas chamber at Missouri State Penitentiary. We are the biggest prison in the United States. I mean, he could explain to a court much better what was going on. And again, my modus operandi, not very far from thought to action. I immediately spoke to Professor Forrison, who was advising me during this court case that we were in. He said, Robert, could you go to Boston to meet that technician? And that man was Fred Leuchter. So Dr. Forrison immediately, naturally, here was the answer to his dreams too, flew to Boston that same afternoon, met Fred Leuchter the evening. So we acted very quickly on it because, of course, the trial was going on, and I had hoped to introduce his testimony. Dr. Forrison calls me at 6, 7 o'clock at night, very, very depressed. He said, Ernest, that Leuchter, technician in gas chambers, he believes in the Holocaust. He's not going to be a good witness for us. I said, Robert, look at, you didn't believe, you believed in, now let me see. Yeah, you believed the Holocaust took place. I believe the Holocaust took place. And we are the same people. We are not interested, Robert, what he believes. Because you and I, we changed our mind. Why couldn't Leuchter change his mind when he got better facts? So I said, don't come home yet. Go tomorrow morning, see him again, talk to him again, and see if you can get him to come to Toronto. Dr. Forrest-Horn goes back, talks to Fred Leuchter. Fred Leuchter turns out to be in search of knowledge himself in this topic. And so Dr. Forrest-Horn asked him, why do you think the Germans had this method of killing people, and why do you think it was so efficient? Leuchter, the engineer, said, well, the Germans gave us rockets, they gave us submarines, incredible weapons, and jet planes. Why shouldn't they have developed a better gas chamber? That was Fred Leuchter's answer. But I thought it was pretty logical. But I said, I'm not interested in what you believe and why you believe it. Come to Toronto, and then we look at the models of Auschwitz which I had built, the technical drawings of Auschwitz we had built, and that convinced him that it couldn't possibly be true, and he was so curious that he went to Auschwitz. So that's how Fred Leuchter's report, I'm asked to talk about that, came into being. So I put together a team. Fred Leuchter, a graphic man who made drawings of plans of these facilities, because nobody in the whole history since the Second World War had ever made plans of these facilities. They just took these chicken coops and thought that was it. But so we proceeded forensically document the facilities in the place. And in that time, there was a communist government in Poland in place. And how do I get my team with chisels, hammers, rubber gloves, measuring tapes, how do I get them into Poland to do these forensic examinations? Well, I put the team together, photographer, videographer, a translator that spoke 5 languages, including Polish, so we could negotiate. And I gave them a bag of ladies' stockings, seamless silk stockings, calculators, chewing gum, all material that they could grease the way, propina, with these things. And so my team left, went to Poland, and we had agreed with Fred that he would not allow anybody to call me back in Toronto. And because telephones are being monitored for ages, and I said, don't call me, do the work that you have to do, come back out when you have done it, and then we present it to the court. Well, little did I know that things can go wrong massively, almost like divine interference. So we are going on the way to court one morning. Leuchter is safely in Poland with his team doing his work, and I get a call from an American officer, very command-like voice. And he said, this is bereavement officer, whatever, MacDonald. And he said, Mrs. Leuchter, we're looking for Mrs. Leuchter. And we know that they are working for you, Mrs. Leuchter, Fred Leuchter. And I have some bad news, and I wonder if you could give me their address, telephone number, where they are. Turns out that Mrs. Leuchter, one of her sons, died, got killed on an American airbase. And he was dead. He was in the morgue of the airbase. And so this bereavement officer's job was to tell the mother, sorry, but your boy has died. It's the standard routine. And these are professionals. You cannot turn them down. They throw them out the front door, they come in the back door. And so I made the excuse that we had to go to court, and call me back after we come back from court. The man never called me. And I thought, that's odd. This morning he was so hot to trot that I get him the address. Well, it turns out he's not exactly a dummy either, these American officers that have these jobs. He called the mother of Fred Leuchter. And Fred, being a typical American, couldn't keep a secret, told his mother, his 80-year-old mother, everything about his trip. And so the bereavement officer knew where they were, what they were doing. And for the first time in modern history, something worked in the state of Poland. The State Department called the radio. So that's the way it is, because in Europe, in Poland, nothing happens normally. And so the officer got to the State Department got in touch with Polish state radio, and the secret that I wanted to keep so secret is now being broadcast all over Poland, state radio. We are looking for Fred Leichter, an American gas chamber specialist, and he is in Poland. We're looking at Camp Majdanek, Auschwitz, Chełmno, and I mean all the secrets that I was afraid of they were going to blow. The state radio broadcast all over Poland. So I didn't know anything of that. I was back in Toronto, going back and forth to court, and Fred Leichter and his team, snow on the ground in Poland, it's cold, it's winter, are in one godforsaken little camp in the countryside, and they were chiseling away and taking samples, putting them in plastic bags with, what do they call that? In order that they don't breathe on it. Masks in front of their face, put the dates on and everything else, and suddenly they see two SS men. They look like SS men, Polish military officers, coming across the snow toward the snow in that camp where they were chiseling away, and the chiseling made, of course, terrible noise. And so my friends thought they had been caught. But the Polish officers were there because the state radio had said they should look for Fred Leichter, and they found Fred Leichter. So Mrs. Leichter is confronted inside that alleged gas chamber there in Poland with the news that her son is dead. And so Fred said, well, then we go home. And Mrs. Leichter, who was not political, made the decision. She said, no, this is a historically important investigation. We are not leaving for Poland. We are finishing this mission. And then she talked as the mother to the two policemen, come to see us tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock in the hotel. By then we will be finished. 11 o'clock the next day, the two cops came with a whole column of police cars. And so my best kept secret, is all over the countryside. They're escorting my team with all the samples that they took from inside these facilities. They took with police escorts, with sirens howling, black and red lights flashing, clear across Poland to Warsaw. They ended up in Warsaw, up the ramp to the departure gate. Nothing but Polish uniformed police saluting as they walked past. In the trunk of their luggage were all these very important samples for my court case in Toronto. And so, 11 o'clock the next night in the evening, Fred Leichter called. The bald eagle has landed was the code word once they were safely back in the United States. So can you imagine that the death of that boy was able to get us all these samples out? Nobody opened their trunk, nothing. All the chisels, the hammers and so on were safe. So you talk about it being a God in heaven. It was an amazing thing. And so I said to Fred Leichter, Fred, now we have to hasten this thing because the court case is going on and I want you to present this material. Well, Fred made his report. Turned out to be a fantastic report from the point of view of German people. And it revolutionizes the look at the Second World War. I'm not allowed to tell you safely, but obviously for the German cause it was very important. And when I realized that he had found such good news for the Germans, I looked at my calendar, and April was, we were moving into April. And so I said, this would be an opportune time. I could get Fred Leichter on April 20th, Adolf Hitler's birthday, to present this report in the court in Toronto. And my own attorney didn't know that I had planned that. It was a birthday gift to Adolf Hitler. You asked me that I should present the evidence. how the evidence is for this report. This is the first Leuchter report, but this is the popular edition. This is what I call my Mickey Mouse edition, because it's small type, but essentially all the material is in here. This world-shaking, revolutionary expose of what Leuchter found. Now, I digress a little, but it's important. You all know David Irving, the British historian. David Irving didn't particularly like me because I was a loudmouth and I was openly National Socialist, and he was very cagey always, and so he kept his distance from me. But one day I was able to help him out of a financial problem that was very embarrassing to him, and then he said spontaneously, "Ernst, if you ever need help and you need me, my testimony as a British historian, you can call upon me. You have saved me this massive embarrassment, and I'll come and help you." Little did I know that I was going to be retried in the Canadian court. And so when Leuchter had gone to Poland and had come back, and the report was very good, I called David Irving in Florida, where he was writing on another book, and I said, "David, you promised to help me if I was in a jam. Well, I am, and I send a team to Auschwitz, and they have just come back." And so this famous British historian answered me this way. He said, "And?" That was all. "And?" and I said, the results are very good for Germany. And so he responds, "Zündel, I'll be coming." Now, I don't know if many of you know David Irving. He is a very handsome, tall, the man is like a movie actor. And he was down there in Florida writing on his book, and he suntanned, and he looked like a model out of a film. He arrived in Toronto. He had no socks on. He had sneakers on, and he had a beige pair of pants on, an open shirt, no jacket, only his luggage, and that's how he was going to testify in court. I couldn't believe it, So I said, "How am I to interpret this?" Well, I can interpret it for you. He came to Canada because he thought that I was going to buy him, because he buys very expensive suits. He gets up on the podium and he says, "Oh, ladies and gentlemen, my suit cost, but how much was it? $2,000. It's silk and it's made by the Queen's tailor. And his extra pants are $500. And so I thought to myself, well, I'm a peasant. I'm not going to give this guy a brand new $5,000 wardrobe. And so I said to my attorney, Doug Christie, who looked exactly like him in size, I said, "Doug, what's your suit size?" So he said, "Well, it isn't the size." I said, "Can you lend that to David Irving?" So here, instead of getting a new wardrobe from Ernst, he got a second-hand tie, which I had got at the Goodwill store. He got Doug Christie's suit, and he went to court in front of these famous reporters, 30 different news outlets, in a borrowed suit, and all it cost me is a second-hand shirt for $3.75. Now, the prosecutor in Canada had always said, "Zündel, you don't believe that this took place and that took place." But David Irving, he said that 77 famous National Socialists knew that it took place. But I, in the meantime, knew that Irving had changed his mind. And so we let the prosecutor talk, and Irving steps into the witness box. I was supposed to get in after Leuchter, but Irving, we called him in as our secret weapon, and Irving steps into the witness box, and the first thing that the prosecutor says, "Mr. Irving, you used to write that it took place and so on, and now you are denying it took place." Well, Irving says, famous historian, over 40 books to his name, hand on the Bible, and he says, "Well, then I believed Now I know. And there is a difference. And when he stepped in the witness box, the media was, there was wall-to-wall media because it was a sensation. And he revised his own attitude in open court. I have never seen such manliness that a man, an author of 40 books, would repudiate, refuse to endorse his own books. This was an absolute unusual sensation. And Irving said, I'm negotiating with my New York agent, a Jew, for the pocketbook rights of a book, a famous book of his, and $1.5 million potentially right on me getting that book deal in New York. If this Jewish kind of agent finds out what I'm saying today in the courtroom in Toronto, I'm bound to lose $1.5 million. And yet he repudiated his own false information. Now, they grilled David Irving mercilessly on the Leuchter report, the prosecution and the judge. And I thought to myself, they'll break him, because whatever he had said before was contrary to what he was now saying in court. But that man, in a 3.5-day session in these Canadian courts, stood by the ground, and then they asked him, so what do you think of Mr. Zündel? And he turned around to me, this famous man that he didn't like for decades, turns around and says, that was a stroke of genius to do this, to send Leuchter to Poland. I wish I would have done it myself. And now you can imagine, this was like a new history. And David Irving had hoped that he would be the pioneer of the new history, because it revised basically how we understood the history of the Second World War to be. And he said that he would like to have the rights to the Leuchter report in English, to put in England and in Wales and in New Zealand and Australia these Leuchter reports out. And he did. And the world collapsed about him. That poor man has paid a terrible, terrible price. He has paid a more terrible price than I have paid for having done this, because he was so famous. I was only infamous, but he was famous. And his books wouldn't be sold in bookstores anymore. That man lost, in effect, his career, his life, his income, and his reputation. That's David Irving. So the publication of the Leuchter report has repercussions. You see, when you asked me to tell to you what the Leuchter report was like, how it came to be, well, I told you now how it came to be, but there is an aftermath. After the publication, after it came out. And I quickly saw to it that we had French editions, Spanish editions, Arabic editions, and so on. And it went around the world. And for David Irving, it was terrible with the results. And for me, it had like delayed action results. Because my enemies have never forgiven me, will never forgive me for having done what I did with this publication. And I was, of course, fully alert that this was going to be my fate. I was not blind to the power of my enemies. And I did not do this publication and bring Leuchter to Toronto, to the courtroom, for myself. Because for me, introducing the Leuchter report in my defense was a disaster. It made my enemies far more furious than if I had not brought it. But I wanted to do this because we had, for the first time, separated the paper war and elevated it to a scientific plateau. And it was a totally different ballgame from that moment on. And I did that for humanity. I can honestly say that. Because Germany was one of the leading intellectual and productive nations in Europe. You could say Germany was the leading nation in Europe. And that the world accused my fatherland of this genocidal maniac deed, poisoned the relationship between all kinds of other nations, and I wanted to remove the poison. And if it killed me as a person, as it nearly did, but if it killed me, this little publication was my gift to the world to free them from this terrible trauma that was induced in the people of the world after the Second World War. So people have asked me, "Oh, Ernst, was it worth it? Would you do it again?" Naturally. Naturally, with my mother in my ear, that I had to do this. Was I going to say, no, I would never do it again? No, I can tell you quite honestly, I consider it a privilege. I consider it a privilege. And it humbles me that I was chosen by destiny to bring this forth. And I all the prison cells, all the times when I had a chance to renege, it never ever occurred to me that I could renege on having done that. So I am proud and can tell you I'm glad that I did it.